So in part 1 and part 2 of this series, I tried to show that the idea that animal death as the result of man's sin is not cannot be biblically derived from the Old Testament texts. And this view I'm expressing is the rabbinic view of the fall that rabbis and Jews today still hold, as you can see here.
That is the resurrection. And we will be ushered into that new world which is called Olam Haba. So the world to come is a world which does not yet exist. It's a world into which we're going to enter with body and soul. And the Tchias HaMeisim is not a return to this world. The Tchias HaMeisim is the resurrection which enables us to enter that new world. And this is the opinion of the mystics. And Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto says a fabulous thing. He says, what would have happened if Adam would not have sinned? We ask the question, what would have happened? He has been in this world forever. This is simply the point. Says the Ramchal an amazing thing. He says that if not for the sin, if Adam would have lived as he was meant to live, this world would have evolved into a world to come.
So we see here there's no mention of a perfect original creation. Instead, this interpretation that I'm holding is very consistent with a lot of early Jewish text belief. But what one could say is, although the Old Testament is absent of such claims, one could look to the New Testament, and particularly the writings of Paul, and say that Paul is writing kind of differently out of his culture of his time. And Paul does disagree a lot with what Jews and rabbis are saying, so this seems plausible. So let's look at the text that Paul uses, or skeptics use to say Paul is arguing for no animal death before sin. So skeptics usually turn to Romans 5:12. There are problems, though, with trying to stretch that interpretation. Now, clearly here, this death spreads to all people, all men. But one cannot use this to say it spreads to all of creation. Now, if Paul had said all of creation suffered as a result of Adam's sin, then that would be a very good case there for what many claim. However, since the passage says that death spread to all men, it limits it to the spread to the humanity. Now, some will say that doesn't matter because it's death in itself that's entering the world. But I think this fails to miss the point as to why Paul is limiting this to the spread of humanity. Because Paul here is not talking about physical death. So if we go just a few chapters later, in Romans 7:9, it says, "For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandments came, sin revived and I died." So Paul was saying he once was alive, and then he died. And the commandments which was to ordain to life I found to be death. Here, this clearly cannot be talking about physical death here. It has to be talking about spiritual death, unless Paul died somehow and came back from the dead. Throughout the Bible, animals are never said to commit sin as a result. And I would argue this is because animals do not possess the knowledge of good and evil. When Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they became aware that they were naked. Very few animals have aware or knowledge of nakedness or weakness. There's things that are imparted to us by the fall via the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So trying to interpret the verse as death sprang to all creation doesn't make much sense. But if we look how Paul is using death throughout these chapters, it seems reasonable to say he is using spiritual death. And there's certain instances where we must say he is using spiritual death because the alternative is simply absurd. Now, of course, this does not mean that Paul believes no physical death resulted at man's sin. I think Paul believes that Adam both physically died and spiritually died. It just means you cannot use Romans 5:12 to cite this example. So often then skeptics will try to point to 1 Corinthians 15. So first advocates will say that verse 22 when it says in Adam all die in the verse, it must mean that by all, the Greek word pos is used for all here, that it must refer to all of the creation being afflicted, which is pretty easy to refute when we look at how the Greek word for pos is used throughout Scripture. By meaning all in context, it just simply means all men. 41 times in the New Testament where pos is used in context, it just means all men. And considering the context of 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about the resurrection of the dead, and we have a list of eyewitnesses, and then Paul goes on to talk about men rising from the dead, each in his own order, it seems unlikely Paul here is referring to the totality of creation. Unless there's something about the context that one can point to say that this is all creation, it cannot be argued for just simply by saying all. So the second argument advocates may make is from verse 21 that says by man came death, and they would argue here that death simply means physical death again, and so if by man came death, there must not be physical death in the world prior to the fall. However, in the Greek culture at the time, death, or thanatos used here, refers to the Grim Reaper. You see, in Greek culture at that time, the Greeks believed that death, or thanatos, was a personal force that carried the dead to Hades, or in the Hebrew Sheol, or the underworld. And likewise, Christians in the first century kind of followed and carried along this idea of treating death as a personal force. For example, in the Apocryphas, the Gospel of Bartholomew depicts death as being the carrier to Hades, or the underworld. And we see in the book of Revelation as well, the author depicts death as being a rider on a horse. Behold the pale horse. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is using death, or thanatos, in a personalized sense. He's saying death is the enemy, the last enemy to be defeated. So Paul believes that death is the carrier of the dead to the underworld, and he believes that death entered this world because of Adam's sin. And likewise, he compares Christ to being the opposite of death. So death is what takes you to Hades, but Christ is what takes the dead from Hades to heaven via the resurrection of the dead. So Paul is paralleling the two in verse 21. By man came death. So because of man, death force came and took people to Hades. But by man came the resurrection of the dead. By the man came Christ, and he carried the dead from Hades to heaven in the resurrection of the dead. Now we could talk about the distinction between physical death and spiritual death, and how one can be physically alive yet still in Hades, but I think that's a much bigger topic that I don't think I can fit in this video. It deserves a video of its own, so I'll leave it for now. Also, when we read further, we see skeptics seem to have a problem when Paul describes the original body of Adam and the new body of Christ. He describes Adam's body as being able to be perishable. For example, in verse 42, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. Is sown in dishonor, is raised in glory. Sown in weakness, raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So Paul is comparing the first humanity's body as being mortal and subject to decay, whereas the second body is described as being imperishable. But here's where it gets interesting in verse 45. Paul says, so it is written, the first man Adam was made a living soul. The last Adam is a life-giving spirit. Now this is really interesting. Paul ties Adam's body with the first body, or of humanity. Hence, Paul is suggesting that Adam's body was mortal in nature. In verse 46, the spiritual did not come first, but the natural. Paul says the natural body is subject to decay. And after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth. The second man is of heaven. So if Adam's body was subject to decay, then how can it be that all the creation would also not be subject to decay too? Now you may be thinking, well, wait a second then. How did Adam die? Like, how did he resolve? Well, Adam had conditional immortality. Provided Adam ate from the tree of life, he would have kept living for forever. The second he got kicked out of the garden, there was no magical curse that fell upon him. His body stayed the same, and he just grew old, subject to decay, and as a result died. So one, if Adam's body wasn't subject to decay, or was subject to decay, why should we expect the rest of creation's body to be in an immortal state and suddenly change at the whim of Adam's sin if Adam's ontological nature didn't change at all? Some may object to this and say that clearly some element of the creation must have changed, because it says, curses the ground because of you, and toil you'll eat of it all the days of your life. And it also speaks of thorns and thistles arising. However, this is unlikely. There are two instances in the Bible where God curses the ground because of man. One during the fall, but two during the flood. And when we look at the flood account, there was no magical ontological change to the creation. God simply sent a flood, and as an end result, the ground or the land was damaged and harmed by that. So simply cursing the ground does not mean a hex was placed upon the ground. So most likely, curses the ground is the initial statement, but the final part of verse 17 and verse 18 is an explanation of how the curse is going to be implemented. And it will say, because of you, through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, which is a sign of poor nutrient soil, and you'll eat of the plants of the field. Because Adam refused to work with God, instead he disobeyed God, and so he could not spread the paradise of Eden to the rest of the world. Hence the rest of the creation suffers as a result. So it is not that creation is hexed, it is rather that the rest of creation was denied the opportunity to experience the bliss that was in Eden. This interpretation makes the most sense because it invokes elements of the story. It invokes man leaving the garden being a paradise and separate from the creation. Whereas the interpretation that God hexed all the creation seems slightly cruel, since the rest of creation wasn't really involved in the act of sinning. And finally, we turn to Romans 8:20. Advocates tend to, however, assume a perfect original creation, and then they argue that since the creation was subject to decay, and decay is bad, therefore this must have occurred at the fall. However, this assumes Paul held to a perfect original creation, which I think other passages like 1 Corinthians 15 suggest otherwise. So the most reasonable interpretation is that creation was subject to futility and decay from the beginning, just like Adam was subject to decay. And Paul seems to allude that the solution and what creation is waiting for is the revealing of the sons of God. So Paul ascribes man as being part of the solution to the creation's futility. And it seems that Paul is looking back to Genesis 1:28, where man is called to subdue and kavesh and radah, rule over the creation. Hence man is connected to bringing peace to the cosmos, that the cosmos is in a state of chaos, and that man is connected in bringing order to it. And Paul looks forward to the coming of the sons of God, or the children of God, as being a fulfillment of that original promise. So I hope you enjoyed this series. Let me know what you think. Like, comment, subscribe, leave a comment comment below of your thoughts, and have a nice day.